My name is Caroline. I learned to disappear long before I learned how to stand my ground. It was supposed to be a quiet Sunday lunch, but my sister never allowed peace to linger when I was around. The tension always sat just under the surface, like a thread pulled too tight. She had always been the one with the grades, the charm, the praise. And I, the wanderer, the one who hadn't found her place. When she shouted across the table that I was a nobody, the words weren't new, only louder, sharper. The guests fell silent, eyes darting between us. Her voice still echoed when she leaned back in her chair with that satisfied smirk, as if she'd finally said what everyone had been thinking. Before we continue, drop a comment. Where are you watching this from and what time is it there? I'd love to know how far this story is reaching. I felt like a shadow at my own family gathering. My father looked away. My mother fidgeted with the napkins. No one defended me. Again. I swallowed hard, the bitterness catching in my throat. I'd learned long ago not to cry in front of them. I'd learned to let the humiliation pass quietly, like a storm no one acknowledges even as it floods the room. Her fiancé, Andrew, sat frozen. I assumed he'd laugh along eventually. They all did. No one ever took me seriously. I was the unfinished sentence in every family story. The one who didn't quite fit in the frame. This time was different, though. It wasn't just us in the safety of our family home where wounds could be hidden under the rug. Vanessa had waited until we were surrounded by friends, colleagues, and future in-laws. Faces I'd never seen before now witnessed my public execution. At least I'm doing something with my life, she continued, wine glass tilting dangerously in her manicured hand. What are you even doing these days, Caroline? Still, jumping from job to job, every syllable felt like a needle. Precise. Intentional. I'd come dressed in my best, hoping this time would be different. The dark blue dress I'd carefully selected hung from my shoulders like surrender. You know, my mother finally spoke. Her voice soft but somehow making it worse. Your sister is just concerned. We all are. Concerned. That word. Their favorite weapon wrapped in cotton. I pressed my lips together, feeling the memory of all the times they'd used it before. When I switched majors. When I turned down the job at my father's firm. When I broke up with the boyfriend they approved of. Always concerned. Never proud. My throat burned with words I couldn't say. How do you tell the people who are supposed to love you that their concern feels like a noose? That their expectations suffocate while they call it caring? I looked down at my plate, at the food I'd barely touched. The roast beef my mother had, spent hours preparing. The potatoes my sister had criticized for being undercooked. The green beans nobody wanted but tradition demanded. Everything in its place. Except me. I'm doing fine. I managed. 2 decades of practice had taught me how to speak without revealing the tremor in my voice. Fine? Vanessa laughed, and others nervously joined in. Fine isn't an achievement, Caroline. It's what people say when they've given up. That's when I felt it, that familiar tightness in my chest. The one that used to send me running to the bathroom at family gatherings. The one that made me fake illness to avoid dinners. The one that had me practicing smiles in the mirror until they looked convincing enough. Andrew cleared his throat, and for a moment, I thought he might say something. But he just reached for his water glass, gaze fixed firmly on the tablecloth. Another silent witness to the Caroline show, the family's favorite recurring entertainment. Remember when you wanted to be a writer? My father finally joined in, his voice carrying that particular tone reserved just for me, a mixture of disappointment and faint amusement. You filled all those notebooks. What happened to that? What happened was you told me it wasn't practical. What happened was Vanessa got a journalism scholarship, and suddenly my words didn't matter anymore. What happened was I put those notebooks in a box and buried them beneath winter clothes I never wore, but I said none of this. I changed my mind, I replied, forcing a smile. People do that sometimes. Not successful people, Vanessa quipped. Successful people commit. How many times had I heard that? How many times had I watched my family confuse stubbornness with strength? They spoke of commitment, as if changing direction was weakness, as if adaptability wasn't survival. Tell us what you're doing these days, urged my aunt, trying to sound encouraging, but I could hear the curiosity beneath it. Any prospects? The way she said it made it clear she meant both professional and romantic. In my family, being single at 28 was nearly as disappointing as being unemployed. I was neither, but somehow they'd never bothered to update their perception of me. I'm working, I said simply. At that coffee shop still? Vanessa pressed, knowing full well I hadn't worked there in years. I felt the familiar burn of injustice. The way they locked me in time, refusing to see growth they hadn't witnessed or approved. In their minds, I was forever the 19-year-old who'd dropped out of business school, a perpetual disappointment preserved in amber. No, I said, not at the coffee shop. Something in my tone must have caught Andrew off guard, because he looked up then, his eyes meeting mine briefly before darting away. He knew. Of course he knew. But here, in this carefully orchestrated performance of family dynamics, we both had our parts to play. Carolyn helps people find jobs, my mother offered vaguely, as if trying to salvage my dignity with this deliberately imprecise description. Some kind of recruiting? I almost laughed. 3 years of 80-hour weeks, of international conference calls at 3 a.m., of building a company from the ground up, reduced to some kind of recruiting. But this was how it had always been. They created a narrative about me, and no matter what I did or said, that narrative persisted. Human resources, Vanessa corrected with a dismissive wave, processing paperwork for the people who actually run things. I took a sip of water, letting it cool the words I wanted to hurl back at her. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine standing up, telling them everything. About the offices in Singapore and London, about the Fortune 500 clients, about the team of 63 people who answered to me, about the features in business magazines they never read. But I knew better. I'd tried before. They'd nod, make appropriate sounds of interest, and by dessert, we'd be back to Vanessa's accomplishments or my failures. Anyway, my sister continued, turning to the rest of the table. We've finally settled on a venue for the wedding, the Langham. We had to pull some strings, of course, but Andrew's firm has connections. Andrew's firm. The irony made my water taste bitter. The conversation mercifully moved on, flowing around me like I was a rock in a stream. I watched them discuss the wedding plans, the flowers, the guest list, the honeymoon options. I watched my mother beam with pride. I watched my father clap Andrew on the shoulder like the son he never had. I watched Vanessa soak it all in, this spotlight she'd been born into and had never had to share. And I thought about the email waiting in my inbox. The one confirming my company's acquisition of Andrew's firm. The one I hadn't mentioned to anyone because, really, what was the point? Will you be bringing anyone to the wedding, Caroline? My mother's question yanked me back to the table. I haven't decided, I replied. You should, Vanessa said. It's sad attending alone, and I've seated you with some nice guys from Andrew's office. She smiled sweetly. Nothing too high up. Don't worry. I know you get intimidated by successful men. I felt a sudden rush of heat up my neck. Not embarrassment this time, but anger. Pure, clarifying anger. The kind I'd been taught nice girls don't express. The kind I'd built a career channeling into ambition instead. Actually, I started, but Vanessa was already talking over me. Just try not to talk about your job too much, she advised loudly. Men hate that, especially when women try to sound important. That's when it happened. The moment that would divide my life into before and after. The catalyst that would finally force the truth to the surface. "For God's sake, Vanessa," my sister snapped, wine sloshing dangerously close to the rim of her glass. "Nobody cares what Caroline does for a living. She's a nobody. Always has been. Always will be." The table went silent. Not the awkward silence of earlier, but something deeper, heavier, the kind that rings in your ears, the kind you can feel on your skin. I sat perfectly still, back straight, hands folded in my lap, face composed into that mask I'd perfected years ago. I could feel eyes on me, curious, embarrassed, pitying. I could feel my father's discomfort, my mother's anxiety, Andrew's tension. But I didn't look at any of them. I looked at my sister, really looked at her. And for the first time, I didn't see the golden child, the favorite, the star. I saw someone small, someone whose entire sense of self depended on my diminishment, someone terrified of what would happen if the family story suddenly changed. "Vanessa," my mother finally whispered. "That's enough. Too little. Too late." The damage was done, the words hanging in the air like smoke after a fire. And then, Andrew did something none of us expected. He placed his napkin carefully on the table. He straightened his shoulders, and he stood up. The simple action commanded attention. Everyone turned to him, perhaps expecting him to excuse himself from this uncomfortable scene, to step outside for air or to make a phone call. That's what people in our family did when emotions got too raw. They left. They composed themselves. They returned when the mess had been cleaned up. But Andrew didn't leave. He stood tall, his gaze steady as he scanned the table before landing on me. And in that moment, I knew. We both knew. The charade was over. "Meet my boss," he said, calm. Clear, almost amused. The silence that followed was different than before. Not the embarrassed quiet after a social faux pas, but the stunned emptiness that comes after an earthquake. When the ground you've stood on all your life suddenly reveals itself to be anything but solid. Vanessa laughed, a short, sharp sound, like glass breaking. "What are you talking about?" Andrew didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on me, a silent question in them. Permission? I gave him the smallest nod. "Caroline isn't in HR," he said, addressing the entire table now. "She's the founder and CEO of Nexus Partners. My company was acquired by hers 3 months ago." My father's fork clattered against his plate. My mother's hand flew to her throat. Vanessa's face drained of color so quickly I thought she might faint. That's not possible," she stammered, looking frantically between Andrew and me. "Caroline she can't." She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't find the words to describe what I supposedly couldn't do. "I was going to tell you," I said quietly. Not an apology, just a fact. "But every time I tried to talk about my work, you changed the subject." It was true. For years, I'd attempted to share my journey. The small wins first. Landing a major client, hiring my first employee, opening a tiny office. Later, the bigger ones, expanding to Europe, being featured in Forbes' 30 Under 30, closing our first 8-figure deal. But my news was always met with distracted nods, quick congratulations that felt hollow, and an immediate pivot back to Vanessa's latest achievement, or my parents' concerns about my personal life. Eventually, I stopped trying. "You've been hiding this from us?" My mother's voice had that wounded quality, the one that had made me feel guilty for my independence since childhood. "Why would you keep secrets from your family?" I almost laughed at the irony. How could she not see? They had never wanted the real me. They'd created a version they could understand, one that fit neatly into their preconceptions. and when I tried to show them otherwise, they looked away. I wasn't hiding anything, I replied evenly. I've been exactly who I am. You just never bothered to look. My father cleared his throat, businessman mode activating as he processed this new information. Nexus Partners, he repeated slowly. The tech recruitment firm? Tech executive search, I corrected. We specialize in C-suite placement for multinational technology corporations. Recognition dawned in his eyes. I could see him mentally flipping through business journals, news segments, industry reports, making connections, recalibrating. You're that Caroline Williams? He asked, incredulity creeping into his voice. The one who turned down the SoftBank investment? I nodded, feeling a strange detachment from the scene unfolding before me. For so long, I'd imagined this moment, rehearsed it in my mind during sleepless nights. I'd thought I'd feel triumphant or vindicated, but sitting here, watching my family's perceptions crumble, I felt nothing but a profound sadness for all the years we'd lost. I thought that was someone else. My father continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. I read the profile in The Economist. I even mentioned it to your mother. He looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in years. I had no idea. Of course he hadn't. They'd decided who I was long ago, and no evidence to the contrary could penetrate that certainty. Not until it was delivered by someone they already respected. Someone like Andrew. I should have said something earlier, Andrew said, finally taking his seat again. But Caroline asked me not to. Professional boundaries. He reached for his water glass, avoiding Vanessa's stunned gaze. When your sister and I first met at the negotiation table, I had no idea you were related. It wasn't until that dinner at your parents' house last Christmas that we realized the connection. I remembered that night clearly. The shock on Andrew's face when he walked into my parents' living room. The quick, silent exchange of glances. The mutual, wordless agreement to keep our professional relationship private. At least for the moment. You've known for 6 months? Vanessa's voice had gone dangerously quiet. You've been working for my sister for 6 months and never told me? Technically, I interjected. He's been working with me for 3 years. The acquisition was just formalized recently. My aunt leaned forward, suddenly interested. Acquisition? You bought his company? I nodded, uncomfortable with the calculating look that had replaced her earlier condescension. I could practically see the mental arithmetic happening around the table as everyone reassessed not just who I was, but what I might be worth to them now. How big is your company? My mother asked hesitantly. 317 employees across 4 continents, I replied. 8 offices. Revenue last year was just under 100 million. Someone whistled softly. I didn't look to see who. $100 million? Vanessa repeated, her voice hollow. That's the revenue, not profit, I clarified, though I knew it didn't matter. The numbers had never been the point. I hadn't built something to impress them. I'd built it because it was mine, because for once in my life, I was writing my own story, instead of accepting the one they'd written for me. An uncomfortable silence descended. The kind that happens when everything people thought they knew suddenly proves false. When they're forced to re-examine not just their assumptions about you, but about themselves. About who they've been to you. Why didn't you tell us? My father finally asked, and for once, he sounded genuinely perplexed rather than accusatory. I considered the question carefully. Not the defensive answer I'd rehearsed in my mind through years of imagined confrontations, but the truth as I understood it now. Because it wouldn't have changed anything, I said softly. Because success only matters if it's visible to others. Because I wanted to be valued for who I am, not what I've achieved. I paused, swallowing against the tightness in my throat. Because if I had to prove my worth to be loved, then it wasn't really love I was being offered. I didn't mean for the words to sound so raw, so honest. But there they were, hanging in the air between us like the truth I'd been carrying silently for years. My mother's eyes filled with tears. That's not fair, Caroline. We've always loved you. Had they? Or had they loved the idea of me? The daughter they thought I should be. The life they thought I should want. I wasn't sure anymore. And maybe it didn't matter. I know you think you have, I said carefully. But love isn't just feeling. It's seeing. Really seeing someone. I stood up then, smoothing down my dress. I should go. You can't just leave, Vanessa protested, panic edging into her voice. Not after this. But I could. That was the thing about finally stepping into your own light. You realized you'd always had the power to walk away. I have an early flight tomorrow, I said, which was true. Singapore. Quarterly review with our Asia team. Andrew can fill you in on the rest. Andrew nodded slightly, professional to the core even in this strangest of personal moments. I grabbed my purse, feeling lighter with each step toward the door. Behind me, I could hear the murmur of confused voices, questions bubbling up as the shock began to wear off. I didn't stay to answer them. Outside, the evening air felt clean, against my skin. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with it. The sky was just beginning to darken, that perfect blue hour when day surrenders to night. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the breeze cool the heat in my cheeks. My phone buzzed in my purse, a text from Andrew. You okay? I smiled slightly, typed back, all good, see you Monday. It had never been about the reveal, never about the dramatic moment when they'd finally see what I'd become. It had been about something much more important, the moment I stopped needing them to see it. I'd spent so many years trying to outrun their perception of me, climbing higher and higher, believing that if I just reached a certain point, they'd finally acknowledge my worth. But standing there on the quiet street, I understood with perfect clarity that I'd been running in the wrong direction all along. The freedom wasn't in their recognition. It was in my release from needing it. I walked to my car, each step steadier than the last. The years of silent building had given me more than a company. They'd given me myself. The truth was, I had been building something. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady. While my sister was busy curating a life worthy of social media applause, I had been working, behind screens, between flights, in late-night meetings she never imagined I could be part of. There were nights I almost gave up, times I thought, maybe they were right, that I was just drifting. But every condescending glance, every family dinner where I was invisible, became fuel. I found mentors who believed in me. I took risks no one in my family knew how to spell. I signed contracts they wouldn't understand. And I learned to smile without showing my cards. I remembered the first office, a tiny room with mismatched furniture and unreliable air conditioning. Just me and 2 employees who believed in my vision enough to leave stable jobs. The terror of that first payroll, when I emptied my savings account to make sure they got paid while I went without. The elation of our first major placement, a CTO for a rising fintech startup. The gradual building of reputation, client by client, success by success. My phone rang as I slid into the driver's seat. My father's name flashed on the screen. I stared at it for a long moment before silencing it and placing the phone face down on the passenger seat. Whatever he wanted to say would keep until tomorrow. Or next week. Or maybe forever. Some conversations weren't worth having. Some bridges couldn't and shouldn't be repaired. I thought of all the Sunday lunches I'd endured. The holidays spent feeling like an outsider in my own family. the achievements I'd downplayed because celebrating them meant inviting comparison or dismissal. The parts of myself I'd hidden away, not out of shame, but self-preservation. And for what? To maintain relationships that diminished rather than nourished me? To keep peace in a family that had never made space for my truth? The engine hummed to life under my fingers. I didn't look back at the house as I pulled away from the curb. Whatever storm was brewing inside those walls, it wasn't mine to weather anymore. My apartment welcomed me with quiet familiarity. No grand penthouse or flashy statement property, just a comfortable 2-bedroom with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. I kicked off my heels at the door, padded barefoot to the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of the Barolo I'd been saving for a special occasion. This felt special enough. Not the reveal, but the release. I carried my wine to the window, watching the city lights shimmer against the darkening sky. Tomorrow, I'd be on a plane to Singapore. Next week, London. The month after that, perhaps São Paulo for the new office opening. My life stretched before me, full of possibility and purpose. My phone buzzed again from where I'd left it on the counter. A text this time from Vanessa. We need to talk. I took a sip of wine, letting the rich warmth roll over my tongue. 3 words that had dominated our relationship for as long as I could remember. We need to talk. Always her needs. Her timeline, her terms. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my laptop and pulled up the file I'd been working on earlier. Proposed structural changes for Andrew's former company, now our newest division. The work centered me, reminded me of who I was beyond the family narratives and old wounds. Hours later, I closed the laptop, stretching tired shoulders. The wine glass was empty, the city outside my window quieter. My phone showed 6 missed calls and 11 texts from various family members. I scrolled through them briefly, noting the evolution from confusion to urgency to irritation. The familiar emotional manipulation, just with a new context. I set the phone down again without replying. They would have to learn, as I had, that some silences speak louder than words. Morning came with golden light streaming through blinds I'd forgotten to close. I moved through my routine with practiced efficiency. Shower, coffee, packing the last few items for my trip. My phone had finally stopped its desperate vibrating sometime around midnight. Now it sat silent, a temporary truce. As I zipped my suitcase closed, it lit up again. Andrew's name this time. I hesitated before answering. Hey, I said, tucking the phone between ear and shoulder as I checked my passport. Hey, he replied, his voice careful. How are you doing? The question was sincere. In the 3 years we'd worked together, Andrew had proven himself to be exactly what I valued most. Straightforward, competent, and remarkably free of drama. I'm fine, I said, and meant it. How's damage control going on your end? He sighed, the sound crackling through the connection. Complicated. Vanessa is processing. I could imagine. My sister had built her identity around being the successful one, the one everyone admired. To discover that the narrative she'd so carefully constructed had a significant plot hole must have been devastating. And the wedding? I asked, though I wasn't sure why I cared. Still on, as far as I know. There was a pause, the kind that comes before difficult words. She wants to know if you're still coming. I hadn't thought that far ahead. The wedding was 2 months away, an eternity in the fast-paced world I inhabited. So much could change in that time, or nothing at all. I don't know, I admitted. I need to think about it. Of course, Andrew said quickly. No pressure. Just, I wanted to check in. Last night was intense. That was an understatement. Years of unspoken truths suddenly exposed, family dynamics shattered and reformed in the space of a dinner. It was more than intense. It was seismic. "Thank you," I said, realizing I hadn't properly acknowledged what he'd done. "For what you said last night. You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," he replied simply. It was the truth. The truth. Such a small word for such an enormous concept. "Are you going to be okay?" I asked, suddenly concerned about the position I'd put him in. "With Vanessa, I mean." He was quiet for a moment. "I think so. We're talking. Really talking, maybe for the first time." Another pause. "Last night made me realize how little I actually knew about her. About your family." I could hear what he wasn't saying, that seeing Vanessa's treatment of me had revealed aspects of her character he couldn't unsee, that witnessing our family's dynamics had raised questions about the future he was walking into. "Families are complicated," I offered, the understatement of the century. "Yeah," he agreed. "Listen, about the Singapore presentation." I was grateful for the shift back to business territory, something solid and manageable after the emotional quicksand of personal revelations. "The deck is ready," I assured him. "The team's done good work. I think the board will be impressed." "I'll be watching the numbers," he said, professional mode fully engaged now. "Text me after the presentation?" "Of course. Talk soon." I ended the call feeling strangely settled. Whatever happened with my family, whether reconciliation or permanent distance, I had built a life that stood on its own foundation. Work that mattered. Colleagues who respected me. A self that existed completely independent of the labels they'd tried to assign me. The car service texted that they were downstairs. I took one last look around my apartment, mentally adjusting to the time. Away. My gaze caught on a small framed photo on the bookshelf. Me at my college graduation, flanked by my parents, Vanessa slightly off to the side. All of us smiling for the camera, frozen in a moment that looked perfect from the outside. I remembered, that day clearly, how my father had complained about the length of the ceremony, how my mother had criticized my choice of shoes, how Vanessa had managed to mention her own graduation honors 3 times during the celebratory dinner, and how I had smiled through it all, already planning my escape, already dreaming of building something that was entirely mine. I turned away from the photo without taking it down. Some memories we keep not because they're pleasant, but because they remind us how far we've come. In the elevator, I checked my messages one last time. A new text from my mother. "Please call us. We need to understand what's happening. Still we. Still grouped with my father as a united front. Still framing the situation as something happening to them, rather than something they had helped create. Still putting the burden on me to explain, to repair, to smooth over." I slipped the phone back into my pocket without responding. Some patterns weren't worth perpetuating. The flight to Singapore was long but productive. I reviewed reports, finalized presentation slides, and caught up on industry news. Work had always been my refuge, the place where I was seen clearly and valued objectively. There was a clean simplicity to business that family relationships lacked. Expectations were explicit, roles were defined, success was measurable. By the time we landed, I had 17 more missed calls. I deleted the notifications without checking who they were from. Whatever crisis was unfolding back home, it could wait. I had actual responsibilities to attend to. The next 3 days passed in a blur of meetings, presentations, and business dinners. The Singapore team was exceeding projections, the new office space was impressive, and the board members were visibly pleased with the quarterly numbers. I moved through it all with focused precision, present in each moment rather than dwelling on Sunday's revelations. It wasn't until the final night, sitting alone on the balcony of my hotel room with a room service dinner, that I allowed myself to fully process what had happened. My phone sat on the table beside me, silent now. They'd finally stopped calling. either respecting my space or giving up entirely. I wasn't sure which I preferred. I picked it up, scrolling through the messages I'd ignored. From my father. "We should discuss this like adults. Call me." From my mother. "Please don't shut us out, sweetheart. We're trying to understand." From Vanessa, a progression from anger. "How could you humiliate me like this?" To wounded pride. "You could have told me yourself." To something approaching introspection. "Maybe we need to talk about some things." And from Andrew, professional updates interspersed with gentle check-ins. No pressure, no demands, just quiet support. I set the phone down again, watching the city lights twinkle below. Singapore had always been one of my favorite places. Efficient, clean, forward-thinking. A city that had transformed itself through sheer will and smart planning. A place that understood reinvention. That night, I slept better than I had in years. Whatever happened next with my family, reconciliation, redefinition, or permanent distance, the weight of pretense had been lifted. I no longer had to be small to make them comfortable. I no longer had to hide my light to maintain their narrative. I was free. The return flight landed early Sunday morning. I'd been gone exactly 1 week since the fateful dinner. It felt like much longer, a dividing line between before and after, between hiding and being seen. As I waited for my luggage, I checked my email. Among the usual business communications was one from Andrew, sent late last night. "Heading to the office today to review the Hong Kong proposal. Stop by if you're back and feel up to it. No pressure." I smiled, appreciating his approach. Always professional, always giving space where needed. It was one of the reasons I'd approved the acquisition of his firm, not just the impressive client list or innovative recruitment methods, but the culture he'd built, the respect that permeated every interaction. I found myself driving to the office instead of home. Sunday mornings were quiet there, just a few dedicated employees and the cleaning staff. I liked the peaceful energy, the space to think without interruption. Andrew was at his desk when I arrived, sleeves rolled up, glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed documents. He looked up, surprised, when I knocked on his open door. "You're back," he said, removing his glasses. "How was Singapore?" "Productive," I replied, leaning against the doorframe. "The board approved the expansion." He nodded approvingly. "Congratulations." I studied him for a moment, noting the slight shadows under his eyes, the tension in his shoulders. "How are things with Vanessa?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Complicated. She's struggling with all of this." I could imagine. My sister had built her entire identity around being superior to me. To have that narrative so thoroughly dismantled would be disorienting at best, devastating at worst. "I'm sorry if I made things difficult for you," I said, meaning it. Despite everything, I didn't wish him unhappiness. He shook his head. "You have nothing to apologize for. Nothing." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Do you have a minute?" I nodded, taking the seat. The familiar surroundings of the office, my office, helped ground me for whatever conversation was coming. "Vanessa wants to meet with you," he said. "To talk. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "She's doing some thinking about the way things have been." I raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Really?" "Really," he confirmed. "Look, I'm not defending anything she's said or done, but she's trying to understand her part in all this." He leaned forward slightly. "She's never had to consider that the family story might be wrong. It's a lot for her to process." I understood that better than anyone. How many years had it taken me to unravel the narratives I'd been given about myself? to separate the truth from the family fiction. "What about my parents?" I asked. Andrew's expression told me everything before he spoke. They're having a harder time adjusting. Your father especially." "Of course." My success challenged not just their perception of me, but their entire worldview. The business strategies my father had insisted were the only way to succeed. The life path my mother had deemed appropriate for her daughters. The hierarchy they'd established and maintained for decades. "I don't know if I'm ready to talk to any of them," I admitted. "I'm not sure what there is to say." "That's completely fair," Andrew said. "No one has the right to demand your time or forgiveness, especially after—" He trailed off, but I knew what he meant. Especially after years of dismissal and diminishment. I looked out his office window at the city skyline. My city, the place where I'd built something from nothing while they weren't watching. "Do you think anything would actually change?" I asked quietly. "Or would it just be a new version of the same old pattern?" Andrew considered this seriously. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "People can change, but it takes genuine effort and self-awareness." He paused, and sometimes the damage is too deep to repair completely. I appreciated his candor. No false reassurance, no pressure either way. "I'll think about it," I said finally. "But not today. Today I need to catch up on sleep and prepare for tomorrow's executive meeting." He nodded, understanding. Always understanding. "For what it's worth," he added as I stood to leave, "watching you run this company has been inspiring. Not just professionally, but personally. The way you lead with both strength and empathy. It's rare." The compliment warmed me, not because I needed external validation anymore, but because it came from someone who'd actually seen me work, who'd witnessed my capabilities firsthand, rather than making assumptions based on family history. "Thank you," I said simply. As I drove home, I thought about what recovery might look like, not a return to the way things were. That was impossible now. But perhaps the slow, careful construction of something new, something honest, something that honored who I'd become, rather than who they'd expected me to be. But I also considered the possibility that some relationships couldn't and shouldn't be salvaged. That sometimes the healthiest thing was to acknowledge the damage and walk away. To invest your time and heart in connections that nourished rather than diminished you. I had no answers yet. Just questions and possibilities. My apartment felt different when I returned to it. Not physically changed, but somehow altered in meaning. Less a retreat from family judgment, more a space I'd chosen for myself, a reflection of my actual preferences, rather than a reaction to their expectations. I unpacked slowly, sorting laundry, checking mail, reorienting to home after a week away. Among the stack of envelopes was a thick cream-colored one I recognized immediately, the formal invitation to Vanessa's wedding. I ran my finger over the embossed lettering, feeling the indentations against my skin. 2 months from now. A lifetime in some ways. My phone rang, interrupting the moment. Andrew again. "Sorry to bother you on a Sunday," he began. "But I just got off the phone with Vanessa. She wants you to know that she's postponed the wedding." I sat down, surprised. "Postponed or canceled?" "Postponed," he clarified. "She says she needs time to figure some things out." I wasn't sure how to respond. This wasn't what I'd expected. Not consequences for her, but reflection. Not the defensive doubling down I'd anticipated, but a step back. "I'll let you go," Andrew said when I remained silent. "Just wanted you to hear it from me first." After we hung up, I sat with the invitation in my hands, turning it over and over. A symbol of the life I'd existed alongside, but never truly been part of. The family events I'd attended but never fully belonged in. The relationships that had shaped me, for better and worse. I placed it on the coffee table, neither accepting nor declining for now. Some decisions didn't need to be rushed. The next morning, I arrived at the office early, ready to dive back into the work that had been my constant when everything else was in flux. But first, I had an email to write. To Vanessa Williams. Subject: When you're ready. Vanessa, I hear you've postponed the wedding. Whatever you're working through, I hope you find the clarity you need. I'm not ready to talk yet. I need time to process everything, just as you do. But when I am ready, if I'm ready, it will need to be different than before. No pretending, no diminishing, no old scripts. In the meantime, I'm here, building what matters to me, living my truth, as I have been all along. Take care, Caroline, I hit send before I could second-guess myself. Not a full reconciliation, not a complete door closing, but a boundary. A statement of worth. A declaration that whatever came next would be on new terms, or not at all. Then I opened my calendar, noting the day's meetings, calls, and deadlines. Life continuing, as it always did. But now on my terms, in my light, with my voice unfiltered. 6 weeks later, my assistant knocked on my office door. "Someone here to see you," she said. "Says she doesn't have an appointment, but hopes you can spare a few minutes." I looked up from my computer, surprised. "Who is it?" "Your sister." I felt my heart rate pick up slightly. We hadn't spoken since that Sunday dinner, though I'd heard updates through Andrew. The wedding, still postponed. Vanessa in therapy. My parents, still struggling to reconcile the daughter they thought they knew with the woman I'd become. I took a deep breath. "Send her in." She looked different when she entered. Subdued, less polished. The Vanessa I knew would never have, appeared in public without perfect makeup and a carefully selected outfit. This version wore minimal makeup, jeans, and a simple blouse. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, rather than the sleek styles she usually favored. We regarded each other silently for a moment, the weight of shared history and separate journeys hanging between us. "Thank you for seeing me," she said finally, her voice lacking its usual confidence. I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "Would you like to sit?" She nodded, perching on the edge of the seat as if ready to flee at any moment. Her eyes took in the office, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the awards displayed discreetly on a side shelf, the wall of books, the elegant but understated furniture. "This is nice," she said. "Professional but warm." "Thank you," I replied, waiting. This was her show. I wouldn't make it easier by asking questions or filling the silence. She fidgeted with the strap of her purse, uncharacteristically nervous. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she began. "About us, about the way I've treated you." I kept my expression neutral, neither encouraging nor discouraging. "I've been seeing someone," she continued. "A therapist. Trying to understand why I needed to put you down all the time." She looked up, meeting my eyes directly. "It wasn't about you. It was never about you. It was about me. My insecurities, my fears. I hadn't expected this level of self-awareness. The Vanessa I knew didn't acknowledge weaknesses or fears. I told myself I was just being honest," she went on, "just saying what everyone was thinking. But the truth is, I was terrified of not being special anymore, of not being the one everyone admired." She swallowed hard. "I needed you to be less, so I could feel like more." The admission hung in the air between us, raw and honest in a way our interactions had never been. "I'm not telling you this to excuse anything," she added quickly. "What I did was wrong. How I treated you was wrong. I wanted you to know that I understand that now." I studied her, looking for signs of the old Vanessa, the manipulation, the performative remorse that would eventually circle back to self-justification. but all I saw was exhaustion and genuine regret. "Why now?" I asked. "Why after all these years?" She considered the question seriously. "Partly because of that dinner. Seeing myself through Andrew's eyes, through the eyes of everyone at that table. It was like finally catching a glimpse of the person I'd become." She paused. "And partly because losing you has made me realize how much I actually need you in my life. Not to compete with, not to feel superior to, just as my sister." I didn't know what to say to that. 28 years of complex history couldn't be untangled in a single conversation. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said into the silence. "I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. Truly sorry. And that I'm working on being better." She stood then, apparently not expecting a response. "That's all I came to say. Thank you for listening." As she turned to leave, I found my voice. "Vanessa." She paused, looking back. "It's going to take time," I said carefully. "I can't just forget everything. But I appreciate you coming here. It means something." A small, sad smile crossed her face. "That's more than I deserve." She hesitated at the door. "For what it's worth, I'm proud of you. Not because of all this," she gestured around the office, "but because you built it despite us, despite me." And then she was gone, leaving me with thoughts I hadn't expected to have and feelings I wasn't sure how to process. That evening, I sat on my balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. My phone lay beside me, a text to Andrew. Half composed, but unsent. I was still figuring out what I wanted to say, about Vanessa's visit, about the tentative, fragile possibility of a new kind of relationship, about the wedding, still in limbo, about the future, uncertain, but somehow more hopeful than before. Below me, the city continued its endless rhythm. People going home to families, heading out for evenings with friends, building lives connection by connection. I'd always viewed my separation from my family as the price of my success, the necessary sacrifice for becoming who I needed to be. But maybe it didn't have to be that way. Maybe there was room for both. My hard-won independence and carefully rebuilt relationships. Not the old dynamics returning, but something new emerging from the ashes of what had been burned away. I picked up my phone and finished the text to Andrew. "Had a visit from Vanessa today. Unexpected, but not unwelcome. Still processing. Dinner tomorrow to talk about it?" His response came almost immediately. "Name the time and place. I'll be there." I smiled, feeling something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not the old, anxious tightness that accompanied thoughts of family, but something lighter, something like possibility. The sun dipped below the horizon, darkness slowly claiming the sky. But unlike so many nights before, I didn't feel like I was standing alone against the gathering shadows. For the first time in years, I felt connected, not just to my work or my achievements, but to the messy, complicated web of human relationships that make a life complete. I thought about that fateful Sunday dinner, how Vanessa's cruel words had inadvertently set me free, how Andrew's simple statement, "Meet my boss," had changed everything. Not because it had vindicated me in their eyes, but because it had finally allowed me to stop seeking that vindication. Justice, I realized then, doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it walks in with a steady step, wears a tailored suit, and drops a truth too elegant to argue with. My family never apologized in unison, but they never looked at me the same again. And I kept building. Not just a company, but a life. One where I no longer disappeared, where my voice was heard, where I stood firmly in my own light, whether they chose to see me or not.